have your attention, please? Can you hear me okay at the back? Thank you. If I or some other speaker fades away at any point, please wave or jump up and down or in some other way get some attention. My name is Rob Crossing. My father, Warwick Crossing, and his brother Dick fought in the second. After my father died, Archie Campbell, also of the second, was closely involved in the raising of my family through legacy. I'm now on the committee of the second Commando Association, and I'm honoured to be our MC again today. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I've been asked to pass on some apologies from people who are not able to be with us today. The Honourable Scott Morrison MP, Prime Minister of Australia, gives his apology. He and the Federal Government are represented here today by Mr Vince Connolly MP, and I welcome Mr Connolly. Senator the Honourable Peter Dutton MP, Minister for Defence, gives his apology. Mr Dutton is also represented here today by Mr Connolly. Senator the Honourable Maurice Payne, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, gives her apology. Senator Payne and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade are represented here today by Mr Darlan Walsh, Acting Director of DFAT's WA office, and I welcome Mr Walsh. The Honourable Anthony Albanese MP, Leader of the Opposition federally, gives his apology. Mr Patrick Gorman MP is with us, representing Mr Albany here today. I welcome Mr Gorman. The Honourable Mark McGowan MLA, Premier of WA, gives his apology. The Honourable John Carey MLA, Minister for Housing and Local Government, and son of second veteran Jack Carey, also gives his apology. Also, the Honourable Paul Papalia, CSC MLA, Minister for Police, Road Safety, Defence Industry and Veterans Issues, gives his apology. Mr McGowan, Mr Carey and Mr Papalia are all represented here today by the Honourable Dan Caddy MLC, and I welcome Mr Caddy. The Honourable Mia Davies MLA, Leader of the Opposition in WA, gives her apology. Ms Davies and the State Opposition are represented here today by the Honourable Colin de Grassa, MLC, Shadow Minister for Veterans Issues, and I welcome Mr de Grassa. The State President of the Returned and Services League, Mr Peter Aspinall, and the RSL CEO, Mr John McCourt, have given their apologies. The RSL of WA is represented here today by Board Member Mr Royce Spencer, and I welcome Mr Spencer. The President of the Australian Commando Association WA, Mr Paul Shearer, has given his apology and is represented here today by the Association's Treasurer, Mr Darren Freeman, and I welcome Mr Freeman. I also note apologies from Her Excellency Ms Inés Maria de Almeida, Ambassador of Timor-Leste, the Honorary Consul of Timor-Leste in Perth, Mr Ted Graham AM, His Excellency General the Honourable David Hurley, ACDSC, Governor-General of Australia, and Her Excellency Mrs Linda Hurley, the Honourable Kim Beazley AC, Governor of Western Australia, the Commanding Officer and Regimental Sergeant Major of the Special Air Service Regiment, other members of the SAS Regiment, members of the Timor-Leste community, Commander Alastair Putt of the Royal Australian Naval Reserve, the Honourable Alana McTiernan MLC, Minister for Regional Development, Agriculture and Food and Hydrogen Industry, the Honourable David Templeman MLA, Minister for Tourism, Culture and the Arts and Heritage and Leader of the Government in the Legislative Assembly, Mr Max Bird, who is the International Manager of the Kwinana Rotary Club and the Project Manager of Rotary Projects Timor-Leste East Team, Mr Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial, and last but not least, Mr Andrew Hastie MP, Federal Member for Canning and staunch supporter of our association, has given his apology as he and his wife have just had a baby and Mr Hastie's attention is required at home. Congratulations to Andrew and Ruth. I also welcome the President of the WA branch of the Australian Special Air Service Association, Mr Adam Slott, the Honourable Jorn Sibma MLC, State Shadow Minister for Environment, Defence Industry, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs, the CEO and former President of Legacy WA, Mr Matt Granger, the District Governor of Rotary District 9465 Western Australia, Ms Patricia Shraven, Ms Joanne Pollard, President of Timor-Leste Vision, Mr John Cram, who's on the committee of our association, and is here today representing Friends of Timor Containers, Ms Kate Haydock of Sir Optimist International WA, and Mr Bevan Piper, an Australian Army veteran who's attending on behalf of the Rotary Club of Kwinana. Mr Piper will lay a wreath with RAN Vietnam veteran Chief Petty Officer Greg Williams, and I welcome Mr Piper and Mr Williams. Thank you all for joining us at our annual commemoration ceremony of the 2nd Commando Association. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the unit's first deployment in 1941, and this is the 72nd time that this ceremony has been held. Last year, we acknowledged the passing of the two men who were, we thought, the last surviving 2nd veterans, John Snowy Went and John Jack Hansen. We were surprised, but delighted to learn a few weeks ago that there is at least one more. That one more being Harry Dorsman. Harry Dorsman joined the 2nd in 1945 and served with the unit in New Britain. Harry's granddaughter Tanya contacted us to say that Harry was about to turn 99. If you're watching today, Harry, thanks for joining us, and thanks to Tanya for getting in touch. The sad fact that there are fewer and fewer surviving veterans does not lessen the importance of this annual ceremony of recognition and remembrance of the 2nd and the East Timorese. We are again streaming the ceremony live to the internet, so if you're watching this on a screen somewhere, thank you for joining us as well. For those of us who are physically present, I invite each of you to sign our attendance book after the ceremony if you haven't done so already. Please feel free to write comments as well. Our catafalque party again comprises Army cadets from 53 Army Cadet Unit Wanneroo, and they are today under the command of CUO La Rochelle Angela. We're very grateful for the excellent and impressive job that the 53 Army Cadet Unit does for us. By way of explanation to those of you who have been to many of these ceremonies, we've made a slight change in that the catafalque party will only be coming forward after my introduction, which, as you've probably noticed, can be lengthy. As part of my introduction, and as this is a commemoration ceremony, I want to say something at the outset about the 2nd service and its achievements. If you already know the story, please forgive me. In my view, the story of the 2nd should be much better known and much more widely acknowledged. For that reason, as this is a commemoration ceremony, here's a summary. In World War II, when it was looking likely that Japan would enter the war, Australia decided to set up its first unit of commandos, and these were selected from volunteers, mostly from WA. Wanting to protect Australia from a Japanese invasion, the government was concerned about the islands to Australia's north, one of which is Timor. The 2nd, also known as the Double Reds because of their colour patch, arrived in East Timor on the 12th of December 1941, a few days after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. At that time, East Timor was a Portuguese colony. Portugal was neutral in the war, and because we expected that the Japanese would offer little or no resistance to the Japanese, the Double Reds were given the job of stopping them in East Timor. By the time the Japanese did invade, the 270 men of the Double Reds were dispersed in small groups around Dili, the capital of East Timor. As the Japanese force initially numbered about 6,000, the Double Reds were hugely outnumbered. Many of them had malaria and couldn't get resupplied with anything, and they couldn't get resupplied with anything or even communicate with Australia for 2 months. However, the 2nd story is a story of true resilience. Using what they had, they began a relentless campaign of guerrilla attacks against the Japanese, ambushing them, sniping, attacking quickly and efficiently before disappearing. The Japanese called them the men who came out of the ground. Because the Double Reds had always been respectful to the East Timorese locals, they had their respect and invaluable assistance, and the East Timorese supplied them with information about Japanese movements, with food, and sometimes help in combat. After 2 months, by relying on their wits and determination, the Double Reds built a radio from parts that they had found or scrounged and managed to contact Australia and get boots, ammunition and other vital supplies dropped to them. So effective was the guerrilla campaign of the Double Reds that the Japanese brought in many reinforcements. The 270 or so men of the Double Reds, later augmented to about 700 with reinforcements from the 2nd, 4th, held some 9,000 Japanese at bay for almost a year. The 2nd was eventually evacuated to Australia before going on to fight in New Guinea and New Britain. As Paul Cleary said, despite the many extraordinary facets to this epic in guerrilla warfare, it appears as a minor footnote in most histories of the Second World War, overshadowed by the New Guinea and Pacific campaigns. Indeed, Australia's official history of the Second World War includes most of the Timor campaign as an appendix. Few people today are even aware that Australia's forces fought in Portuguese Timor and that as many as 40,000 to 60,000 Timorese died as a result of this conflict, far exceeding the losses of any other nation that supported Australians in war. The simple comparative numbers of survival of members of the 2nd Second in the war were impressive. In East Timor, the 2nd Second were about 270 in number, and they lost 10 in combat. I'm not counting the 15 in the ration truck massacre, a war crime in which Australian prisoners were executed. Yes, the unit swelled its ranks when some 700 members of the 2nd Fourth joined them from West Timor, but the unit is said to have inflicted some 1,500 casualties on a Japanese force of 9,000 or more, so you get the picture. In the cold hard analysis of win-lose, life-death, kill or be killed figures, the unit did extremely well. Although it sounds harsh to celebrate those figures, accounting for enemy soldiers until they surrender is exactly what the unit was trained to do. So by that measure, they performed very well. However, if we look at only those figures when we're paying tribute, 2 points should also be made. First, but for luck, training or resources, there go I. That is, it shouldn't be forgotten that both sides of a war involve people, not mere numbers. Just like our soldiers, each of the enemy soldiers had a family, had loved ones, and probably believed that the cause for which he was fighting was just. As we are now at peace with Japan, I pay tribute to the Japanese fallen as well. Second, if we only focus on the sacrifice of those who lost their lives during battle, do we risk overlooking those whose lives were lost not during the war, but later as a result of it? Today I'm asked to focus on the ongoing trauma of war. This has always been an important subject, but it's very timely now, because in 5 days, the Royal Commission into Defence and Veterans Suicide will begin with the first hearing in Brisbane. The existence of a Royal Commission into Defence and Veterans Suicide says to me 2 things. 1, this is a significant problem. So many Australian veterans and defence personnel kill themselves that proper government-sponsored analysis of the problem and strategising is required. 2, we've finally reached this point, this realisation that this problem is real, that it's profound, it's hard to understand, and it's massive. Traditionally, our returned soldiers' suicide has been tragically, suicide has been a common price to pay for having volunteered to fight for Australia. We can and should do more to help these brave people. I don't know the statistics for suicide amongst returned 2nd Second veterans. I could name 4 who suicided off the top of my head, but I know there were more. I want to share a couple of stories with you. One of our guests today is my uncle Kim Crossing. Although he's 95 now, he was too young for active service when the war kicked off. Kim was an RAAF trainee when the war ended, and Kim had 2 brothers in the 2nd Second. Warwick Crossing, my father, lied about his age to volunteer to join Australia's Commando unit, 1st Commando unit, in which he was a sniper. When the unit landed in Dili in December 1941, Warwick was aged 17 years and 2 months. Then, for the following year, he and the other members of the 2nd Second endured the cauldron of East Timor that I described a few minutes ago. When the unit was evacuated in December 1942, he was aged 18 years and 2 months. Consider this, between the ages of 17 and 18, how grown up were you? Warwick's brother, Dick, was 2 years older, and he was in the Royal Australian Navy. He was a crewman on the RAN destroyer HMS Voyager, which ran aground on Batano Beach in East Timor in September 1941, and which was, before long, bombed and shot up by Japanese aircraft. Although most of the Voyager crew were subsequently rescued, Dick Crossing, always something of a tearaway, deserted. Instead of staying to be rescued, and despite the enormous danger, he went to find his brother, Warwick, who was in 9 Section, which was heavily involved in challenging the Japanese who were pushing south. Despite the danger, Dick stayed and fought with the 2nd Second. When the unit eventually returned to Australia, Dick was allowed to stay with the unit for the rest of the war. At the end of the war, he was in the unique position of being honourably discharged from the Navy and the Army. Both Warwick and Dick were traumatised by their war experiences. Both had problems with alcohol. Warwick was apparently more troubled than Dick. Warwick was in and out of psych hospitals. Both of Kim Crossing's brothers suffered with depression and anxiety, and both ultimately took their own lives. Warwick aged 39 and Dick aged 53. The other story is about Mervyn Doc Wheatley, who was a 28-year-old former shearer, horsebreaker, kangaroo shooter from the Pilbara before he volunteered to join the 2nd Second. I want to read a couple of excerpts about him from Paul Cleary's book, The Men Who Came Out of the Ground. Private Mervyn Doc Wheatley was frustrated and angry, and more than anything else, still grieving the loss of his mates. The Japanese had murdered in cold blood 15 men from his platoon on the first day of their invasion of Portuguese Timor. What made matters worse for Wheatley was that his officers seemed reluctant to fight back. It was now April 1942, more than a month since the Japanese had landed in Timor, and Wheatley's platoon had watched the enemy work their way unchallenged into the coffee-growing highlands southwest of Dili, encroaching on the area his company had occupied. Wheatley knew instinctively that, if his company didn't take the offensive, the villagers who were feeding and sheltering them might decide they weren't really worth protecting anymore. So, when an officer asked for volunteers to have a crack, Wheatley was the first to raise his hand. Volunteering ran in the family. Wheatley was one of 5 brothers who were to serve in Australian forces in the war. The lean and sinewy bushman was one of the platoon's snipers, and he was a natural with a rifle. As one of 10 children, Wheatley had begun working on outback stations at the age of 13. After accomplishing himself in all facets of station work, he roamed the Pilbara shooting kangaroos for their skins. Wheatley teamed up with his good mate, Private Stan Sadler, 24, a wheat farmer from Wongan Hills, WA, who was one of the platoon's Tommy submachine gunners. It was as haphazard and poorly planned as this. 2 lowly ranked privates wandering off to have a few shots at a Japanese regiment that had conquered everything in its path, from China to Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies, and now Portuguese Timor. I'll stop reading from the book for a moment. Wheatley and Stan Sadler set off in the direction of the Japanese. They met up with the head of the company's signals section, Lieutenant John Rose, and 2 other signallers, Don Murray and Ron Sprigg. Even though these signallers had far less training in guerrilla fighting, Doc and Stan persuaded Lieutenant Rose and his 2 men to join them. The 5 of them headed off to a spot where they expected some Japanese truck movement between Urmara and Hatalia to set up an ambush. Before long, a truck carrying 15 Japanese troops arrived. They attacked it. The truck stopped, Japs piled out of the back, and the 2 sides exchanged fire. Being a sniper, Doc was in an elevated position not far away. Numbers-wise, it was going well for the 5 Aussies. Then another truckload of Japs pulled up. The Aussies attacked them too before Sadler and the 3 signallers pulled a tactical retreat, meeting up with Doc. Back to the book. The surviving enemy soldiers ran around wildly as they tried to find cover. Some continued to return fire. At this moment, it seemed that some might survive their terrifying encounter with an unseen enemy. Wheatley was not going anywhere. He calmly told Sadler to keep going, he'd catch him later. Wheatley had the situation in hand as he picked off the remaining Japanese from his high vantage point after loading each round with the rifle's bolt action. He placed 5 round cartridges in a row on the ground beside him so that he could reload his rifle without having to look down. The frightened Japanese, who probably couldn't see Wheatley, were running this way and that as he shot them methodically, soon bringing an end to return fire. Before leaving, he put a bullet in the engine block of each truck, and then there was silence. Wheatley picked up his remaining cartridges, stood and casually walked up the hill in the direction of his mates. As he left the ambush scene littered with enemy dead, he felt no sorrow for his victims. In fact, he felt, and quoting from the book, very happy with how he had performed in his first enemy encounter and with what he had achieved. He had, in quotes, repaid the Japanese for the massacre of his mates. He walked up over the hill and found the rest of the party waiting for him. Not only had Wheatley avenged his mates, he'd also defined a very effective form of hit-and-run attack by a small band of men that proved to be a model for guerrilla warfare by his company. Shortly after his ambush, Wheatley conducted an even more daring roadside attack, and the men of his company began carrying out disciplined attacks on the Japanese across the mountains of Portuguese Timor. All of this took place months before the Australians had met the Japanese on the Kokoda track. At that time, when Japan had conquered Asia and had come within striking distance of Australia, the guerrilla war prosecuted by the Second Independent Company amounted to the only offensive action taken by Allied forces against the Japanese in all of the Asia-Pacific region. At this bleak moment, when all other Allied resistance in Asia had ceased to exist, this small group of Australians showed that the all-conquering Japanese could be matched and beaten. You'll hear more about Doc Wheatley a little later when Cherie Hart delivers the address. Although we are here to commemorate the deeds of the men of the Second and the East Timorese, we also remember and give thanks, of course, to all Australian servicemen and women who have served this country in any conflict or peacekeeping role, and all of those who have helped them, including their families. Would you please stand? I call on the Guard Commander of the Catafalque Party to have the Catafalque Party take up its positions around the memorial. Please remain standing for the national anthem. Some of you will remember that a few years ago we did an a cappella version of this, and I'm not keen to do it again, so we'll just wait in the moment in the hope that the music will be ready to go. Please be seated. I'll just hold the thing. Thank you, Louis. In a few moments we will lay wreaths in tribute, and I'd just like to give you some information about the sequence of events. Wait for the Harley Davidson to leave first. In a moment, our piper, musician Davina Goldthorpe, will begin piping a lament. While the lament is playing, the first wreath will be laid on behalf of the 2nd Commando Association by Edith Daysel, the mother of Sergeant Kayla Daysel, who's in the catafalque party. After that, other wreaths will be laid in a sequence that has been communicated to those who've told us that they'll lay a wreath. If you haven't been in touch with us and you'd like to lay a wreath, please feel free to do so, but please see Colleen by the end of the table there as you come forward. Our thanks to all of those who've laid wreaths today. I mentioned Mervyn Doc Wheatley in my introduction a few minutes ago. Cherie Hart is a granddaughter of Doc, and she has kindly agreed to deliver the address today. Please welcome Cherie. I can't win with this.
My fault, because I asked you to lower it for me. Thank you, Rob, for inviting me to speak today, and thank you, Colleen, also. I'm Merv Wheatley's eldest of 3 granddaughters. I'm here today with Merv's 2 daughters, Glenys and Meryl, and my sister Julie. Also my 2 daughters, Sophie and Delissa, my cousin Wendy, and my son Joel could not be here. Merv Doc Wheatley was the 5th child from a family of 10 children, 7 boys and 3 girls. All 7 brothers volunteered to serve in the war effort. All 7 were actively engaged, and all returned home to tell their stories. The second youngest brother, Norm Wheatley, is alive and well today, aged 100, and lives in his own home in Canberra. On the 22nd of January 2006, Merv Wheatley was a pretty fit and healthy 93-year-old. He was living unaided in his own home in Cloverdale, had all of his faculties, and was still reading the newspaper each day without glasses, unlike me. In fact, his GP had just told him that week that he had the heart rate and the blood pressure of an 18-year-old. On that Sunday morning, Merv poured himself a small glass of whiskey from a bottle he kept for medicinal purposes. He took a nip and left the rest. Merv then took his well-oiled 303 into his very well-maintained back garden and stood under the lemon tree that he loved. I've outlived my mates. I've lived by the gun. I should die by the gun. Grandad made this very matter-of-fact statement to me and to his 2 daughters over the last few years of his life. I would always say, "For goodness sakes, Grandad, what a thing to say. Imagine the mess we would have to clean up." Well, when my time's up, that's how I should go. I would object some more, and the conversation would end. None of us ever really thought he would do it. Well, he did. He also made sure to call the police just before he stepped outside to his beloved lemon tree to make sure none of us would have to clean up the mess. Was Grandad's end due to the war? I suspect not fully, but I'm pretty sure it contributed to it. Grandad was born in 1912. He was 28 by the time he arrived in Dili, East Timor. He'd had a pretty hard life up until that point. At the age of 12, he was pulled out of school and sent to work on a dairy farm down south to earn money to send back to his mother to raise his 5 younger siblings. Grandad resented not getting the amount of education afforded to his older siblings and his younger siblings. I remember him reading Albert Facey's A Fortunate Life, and Grandad said Albert had it pretty easy. He went from one farm to another as a child. He moved north and worked in the mines in Kalgoorlie and on stations in the northern Pilbara. Eventually he took up roo shooting. He would say, "You had to be a good shot to make a living. You did not waste good ammo on poor shots." By the time Grandad stepped off the boat at Dili, East Timor, he'd been fending for himself for 16 years. He'd learned to live off the bush. He'd spent significant periods on his own, and he was a damn good shot. Knowing Grandad, he would have had a really good work ethic, a strong and vocal opinion on what was right and what was wrong, and he would have been ready and raring to go. However, nothing can quite prepare you for war. When Grandad returned to Perth on leave after East Timor, and again at the end of the war, Nana told us he would suddenly be overcome with uncontrollable shaking. He would make his way to the nearest pub for a quick couple of shots of whiskey to calm his nerves every time this happened. My mum Glenys remembers from her childhood, Grandad would lie on a camp bed under the veranda of their Byford property, covered in perspiration, suffering from bouts of malaria, and yelling out while hallucinating. However, my mum Glenys and my aunt Merrill say he never actually talked about the war while they were growing up. He kept it all to himself. Instead, he threw himself into work. He established a market garden and an orchard, and not one to ever do anything by half, he became known as Top Price Merv. The family moved to Perth, and Grandad joined the standard gauge railway for a few years, built fiberglass boats until he could no longer stand the skin irritation, and then got to work installing deep sewerage around Perth. He soon moved into a supervisory role and was known as Manhole Merv. I was born in 1970. I loved visiting my grandparents. They had a half-acre block in Cloverdale, and 50% of it was literally covered in neatly ordered rows of vegetables and fruits. His strawberries and his rock melons were to die for. Grandad was a pretty feisty character. He always did the right thing, otherwise you're in trouble. And he was an absolute stickler for punctuality. It was lunch at 12 o'clock on the dot, and you don't be a minute late. He also enjoyed a beer, and he could chat with anybody. He was always doing something interesting and telling interesting tales. He often had interesting visitors, and I loved to sit at the table with the adults and listen in. Still, he never spoke of the war. As I got older, I was absolutely fascinated by two very large, deadly looking, but beautiful, jewel-encrusted Japanese swords he kept wrapped up in his wardrobe. When I asked what the war was like, he would simply say, "Kill or be killed," and would talk fondly of the Timorese people, and in particular of Montello, the young boy who stayed with him throughout his time in East Timor. I remember Keithy Hayes visiting and telling me about his bayoneting and how he survived thanks to a Timorese lady who tended his wounds. I pestered Grandad to tell me more about the war. Eventually, in the early 1990s, when I was in my early 20s, I spent a number of consecutive weekends with him, writing down a memoir of some of his experiences in East Timor. It was an edited version of events. There were some events he would briefly mention and then simply not expand upon them. Other events that I would write down as he spoke, but then he would insist that I cross them out. They were either too terrible to mention, not appropriate in his eyes, or in some cases he was a bit unsure of their accuracy and he'd prefer to say nothing. I kick myself to this day for not going home and keeping my own separate notes of the unedited version. During those days, he relived what he was speaking to me. At times he was extremely angry, and at other times he was completely disgusted with the events that took place. At other times he was actually pretty pleased with himself, and Rob said it, he was very happy. And at other times he was very sad. He told of accidental deaths, commanding decisions that he thought were atrocious, and of his overwhelming desire at times to retaliate and to kill others while he was there. He also told of the abhorrent treatment of the local Timorese by the Japanese, and of fearing for his life while caught in the middle of a local civil war. Most of all, he was devastated at leaving behind young Montello, and he was also devastated for leaving behind his sniper rifle. It was the best rifle he ever had. On the beach the day they left East Timor. He also said he should not be alive. The night the Japanese landed in Dili, Grandad was in the middle of helping Jack Sheehan run a two-up game. Grandad was likely to be up late into the night, so Bob Chalmers offered to take Grandad's turn to drive the supply truck to Dili at 9 a.m. the next morning. Bob Chalmers was murdered by the Japanese on that trip to Dili. Another time, Grandad was assigned with a small group of men to keep watch over the village of Morbisi, which was occupied by the Japanese. They were living in a small hut and would take turns spending a day at a lookout post on the hill overlooking the village. One day, Andy Smeaton offered to take Grandad's turn keeping watch with George Thomas. It was that day that the Japanese attacked. Grandad and the rest of the group, including Taylor, Sadler and Elder, managed to escape, but Smeaton and Thomas, who were positioned at the lookout, were never ever seen again. I then understood why it took Grandad 50 years to really open up and talk about the war. I also understood why he booby-trapped his home. There were gongs set up on the triggers around the house. If someone walked down the side of the house, they would inadvertently always set off a trigger and a loud bang would ensue. He also told me if someone had the gall to lift the tiles on the roof and try to break in to the manhole, well, they were going to get more than they bargained for, and it wasn't a gong. He always maintained his guns. He also built his own handheld pistol, and it worked well. Our lives were full of Grandad's anecdotes and lessons from the war. I would like to end with some of them. Frogs save lives. When the frogs go quiet, watch out. You should always plan ahead, scope out your area. Always, always have an escape route. Keep your body in shape. You don't need a gym. Imagine you're locked in a small cell and there's nothing. There's nothing in that cell. You have to exercise your body and you have to exercise your mind. He would then literally demonstrate to all of us, imagining lifting and pulling and stretching and would give us a lesson on what we would need to do. He would say to us, you are your mind. It's mind over matter. Get control of your mind. You have to stay positive. There is no such thing as can't. There is only can. I brought you up tough. You're strong. You can stand on your own 2 feet. I've lived by the gun. I should die by the gun. Thank you.
Thank you, Cherie. Most of us here today, and most of those who ever attend second commemorative events, have some family or service-related link to the event, to the unit, or to commandos more broadly, or to East Timor. Most, but not all. Greg and Julie Smith are friends of mine who, interested in the story of the second and the East Timorese, have been attending these ceremonies for years. In recent years, Greg has worked as a GP for many years. As an experienced medical doctor, Greg's familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder and with the toll that the trauma of military service can take on returned service personnel. In a few moments, Greg will read a poem for us. That poem is called War, and it was written by Thomas W. Shapcott. Thomas Shapcott AO was born in Queensland in 1935, and he's a poet, novelist, short story writer, playwright and teacher. Despite the broadness of the poem's title, War, the poem is very close to the mark today as we focus on the ongoing trauma of war. That's mostly because this poem is all about observations of the behaviours of the poet's father. Arguably, merely remembering the war is not actually war, but perhaps that depends on your perspective and what the memories mean for you. I really like this poem, but one line of it had a particular effect on me. In the RSL, he became a life member. The poet ironically pointing out that this man's service and the trauma of it would be with him for the rest of his days, like some life membership he didn't actually choose. Please welcome Dr. Greg Smith.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks very much, Rob. It's a privilege to be here today, so thank you very much for asking me to come do this. Sorry. So this is War by Thomas W. Shapcott. Remembrance Day. In school assemblies, talk of manhood achieved in the trenches of World War One. At 17, the boy, my father, ran away from home and enlisted, falsifying his age. Gallipoli had begun. Proudly, he sat for his photo in the glib slogan of his army uniform before he sailed. The other side of war reshaped that soldier, and the later pictures stare bleakly exiled. Yet 50 years have silted over the scars. Impossible for me to recognise my father in either photograph. Time's habit of movement, event, long before my birth, wove in him a tidy shelter of reunion, committee, club, appeal and agenda. The stories that I grew up with of battles and winter in 16 were scraps and relics, toys in an old shoebox. In the RSL, he became a life member. But wars do not finish. It is not over. I speak of more than personal discoveries. Gallipoli, that was a selfish blunder in high places, a battle fought for nothing or for polluted seas of sodden corpses, is other than a ribbon. The errors are not the meaning finally. My father woke struggling one night, an old man in warm pyjamas, into the pillbox concussion of old darkness, and it broke into his age and stranded him. He stumbled past us, his grown sons, a strange dead boy choking him silent and spitting stale blood in the safe rooms of our home, blind for a terrible reckoning, demanding atonement. And we, in the comfortable bedrooms taken for granted always, innocent, were forced among the spaces of his acts and words to where his gains burned through like punishment. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg. Before we read the names of the fallen, and by way of introduction to that, Grace Anna Maya was born and raised in Maliana on the border of Timor-Leste and Indonesia. In 1999, she worked in Batagade as an interpreter for the United Nations mission in East Timor. She went to work for the Australian Embassy in Dili after the referendum for Timor-Leste's independence in 2002, where she met Andrew Tabane. Andrew was working as a defence communication teacher with Defence International Relationship Program, assisting the East Timorese Defence Force. Grace and Andrew returned to Australia and married. They have 2 children, Georgia and Aidan, and the family now lives in Perth. They attend these ceremonies each year, and I'm happy to say that Grace has agreed to read the names of the fallen for us. As Grace comes forward to read the names of the fallen, please welcome her.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, distinguished guests, and welcome everyone. These are the names of the fallen. These men of the 2nd died during active service in Timor, New Guinea, and New Britain. Don Airy, Frank Alfred, Ron Alexander, Jeff Barclay, Roy Birdman, Hugh Brown, Lindsey Brown, Bob Commerce, Bill Cheverton, Gordon Chiswell, Harry Cole, Harry Chatsworth, Dick Chowder, Owen Davis, Kyril Doyle, Bob Ewan, Bruce Gannon, Ken Hogg, Bill Holly, Phil Hopper, Peter Camp, Patty Knight, Tony Lane, Des Lilia, Stan Ludlow, Jack Malley, Laurie Maloney, Harvey Marriott, Eric Mitchell, Percy Mitchell, Les Moley, Gordon McQueenie, Greg Murray, Val Nagel, Jack Northey, Jim Pollard, Don Ramshaw, Kit Richards, Jack Simpson, Andy Smeaton, Fred Smith, Charlie Stanton, Alex Stewart, Bob Swift, George Thomas, Lindsay Thomas, John Walker, Dick Walker, Wally Wordy, Arthur Yates. We honor the memory of this man. We also pay tribute to those members of the Second who have passed away since the war, lest we forget.
Thank you, Grace. Our association's president, Ed Willis, is the son of second veteran, the late Bill Willis. Many of you will be familiar with Ed's fine work as editor of our association's newsletter, Courier. Ed is also a very prolific contributor to our website and our Facebook page. Before COVID-19 came along, Ed also organised very successful tours of Timor-Leste, and I suspect he will do so again before long. As Ed comes forward to deliver the President's report, please welcome him.
Thanks, Rob. Distinguished guests, members, family and friends of the Second Commando Association. As Rob referred in his earlier remarks, my dad was a member of the Signal Section under John Rose, so he had a connection with the events that Rob mentioned earlier on. His Excellency General the Honourable David Hurley, ACDSC, retired, was unable to attend this afternoon's ceremony, but he has very kindly sent a message to mark the occasion. As a brigadier, General Hurley assumed command of the Army's 1st Brigade in Darwin in January 1999. During that period, he oversaw the brigade's transition to a higher degree of operational readiness and its support to Australian-led peacekeeping operations in East Timor. Cognizant of the theme of today's ceremony, he is also the patron of Suicide Prevention Australia. I'll just read the Governor-General's message, which is headed Second Commando Squadron. It is a privilege for me to provide this commemorative message in honour of Australia's 1st Commandos. This year's ceremony will be particularly poignant for those gathered in Kings Park today, as it seems there is only one surviving member of the Second Commando Squadron. This year marks 80 years since the Second Commando Squadron left Australia for East Timor. During the Battle of East Timor, a few hundred Australian troops, all specially trained volunteers, occupied the attention of 9,000 Japanese soldiers for almost a year, at a time when those Japanese could have been otherwise deployed on the Kokoda track or elsewhere. In remembering the members of the Second Commando Squadron and their significant contribution to the victory in World War II, We also acknowledge the sacrifice made by tens of thousands of East Timorese who helped protect the Australian soldiers. To the descendants and supporters of those who served in the 2nd Commando Squadron, as you pause to remember their contribution to the conflict in East Timor, be comforted by the knowledge that Australia greatly values their service and sacrifice, lest we forget. The Governor-General referred to the 80th anniversary of the Timor campaign, and dates from late 2021 this year through next year, 2022, will mark the 80th anniversary of significant events that occurred during the No. 2 independent companies, or the 2nd Seconds campaign on Portuguese Timor during World War II. Jack Carey, the mainstay of the old association in its later years, wrote an editorial for the Courier back in September 2008 that is very relevant to how we acknowledge those anniversaries. Jack titled the editorial "Squaring the Ledger," and he goes on to say, "Much has been written about East Timor campaign during 1942 and the successful guerrilla war waged by the 2nd Independent Company against the far superior Japanese force. This is attributed to the resourcefulness shown by the men themselves, the valuable and timely assistance by a gallant Royal Australian Navy, a determined Royal Australian Air Force, and the mountainous terrain ideally suited for guerrilla warfare. However, it was due to the assistance of the people of East Timor, in the main, who chose to help rather than betray us, which enabled the company to survive and return to Australia. The landing of the Australian and Dutch troops in Dili on the 17th of December 1941 was a violation of Portuguese neutrality and was followed by the Japanese invasion of East Timor that followed on the 19th of February 1942. What followed was that a backward and comparatively peaceful small island became a battleground for the next 12 months, creating chaos for the local inhabitants. After the withdrawal of the 2nd and Dutch forces in December 1942 and the 2nd 4th Company in early January 1943, one would have thought that the Japanese would have treated the people more leniently. Such was not the case. The late Mr. Iwamura, who visited Australia in August 1993 and was an engineer with the 2nd Formosan Infantry Regiment, who occupied the island from mid-1942, confirmed that the people were treated very harshly, resulting in many deaths. To this day, war historians are still arguing as to whether the decision of the Allies to send troops into a neutral country, which resulted in the deaths of thousands of the Timorese, could be justified. Some maintain the Japanese would never have invaded East Timor if Allied troops weren't there, and as they had done in Macau and Portuguese neutrality would have been observed. Summing it up, it was one of the greatest tragedies of the Southwest Pacific War. Timorese casualties, estimated at 40,000 dead or possibly more, were higher than all Australian losses in the island campaigns. Our small association, along with many good Australians of all denominations and walks of life, and other groups, have given an enormous amount of aid of all descriptions to the people of East Timor. This was for the help they gave us back in 1942 and the loss and suffering they endured under Japanese rule and subsequent suffering under Indonesian rule. There is no doubt that the massacre at Santa Cruz in Dili on the 12th of November 1991, the 30th anniversary of which was just being commemorated, galvanised many more people and organisations into helping those unfortunate people. Our troops have also played an important role in maintaining law and order since being the first troops to arrive there in September 1999, and they remained there until 2012. Jack it goes on to say, we rejoiced when the United Nations handed sovereignty to the new government of the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste on the 20th of May 2002, and 4 months later, on the 27th of September 2002, the nation became the 191st member of that world body. It can be fairly said, though not all will agree, that Australia and its people are close to squaring the ledger for what happened back in 1942. The assistance is still continuing and will be for some time to come. Jack's sentiments are also reflected on the words of the plaque that the second veterans installed at the Dare Memorial near Dili back in 1969. That plaque reads, "To all the peoples of East Timor, this memorial and resting place given to them for their use by the Australian people in grateful recognition of their assistance to Australian soldiers, especially the members of the 2nd and 4th Independent Companies during the Second World War." The Dare site has been extensively and attractively redeveloped by the current landholder as a cafe and museum with associated tourist accommodation. This association intends to apply for an Office of Australian War Graves grant to fund the further rehabilitation of the site so that the memorial plaque, unit insignias and flagpoles are reinstalled in a suitable location on the site. I think if I read everything out here, I'm going to be here for too long, so I'll cut to the chase a little bit further down the track. I am the recipient of an Australian Army History Research Grant to prepare what's called a Guide to World War II and East Timor, a site and travel guide. And using money from that grant, I travelled to both Melbourne and Canberra earlier this year to undertake some of that research at the Australian War Memorial, the National Library and the archives in Melbourne. While I was down there, I had the privilege of meeting up with a gentleman who's the only surviving member of the Timor campaign. His name is Jim Elwood, and he will be celebrating his 100th birthday coming up on the 17th of December. Jim Elwood was a cipher specialist with Northern Territory Force signals when he arrived on Timor with the advance party of the No. 4 Independent Company on the 15th of September 1942. He was attached to Sparrow Force headquarters in that specialist capacity and continued in that role when Lancer Force succeeded Sparrow Force on the 7th of December 1942. He then volunteered as a member of the 14-man S-Force Stay Behind Party that was established on the 9th of January 1943 to continue to observe and report on Japanese activities after the departure of the No. 4 Independent Company from Timor. S-Force was evacuated from Timor to Fremantle by the submarine USS Gudgeon on the 10th of February 1943. Elwood actually returned to Timor in September 1943 as a member of the ill-fated SRD Z Special Operation Nagato, and was captured and spent the remainder of the war as a POW, mostly in Dili, and subject to terrible deprivation and torture. Jim Elwood is a brave and honourable man who would have been well known to many of the No. 2 Independent Company men who served on Timor, and Bernard Callanan makes several complimentary mentions of him in his book Independent Company. And I'm sure everybody here would wish him well on this grand occasion of his 100th birthday, which is coming up very soon. I'd just like to mention the second display at the new WA Museum, Bula. A visit with the kids to the redeveloped WA Museum that reopened a year ago today should include viewing the selection of memorabilia related to the unit and the older station that is part of the Reflections exhibition located on level 1. And I'd like to thank Stephen Anstey and Alec Cole from the WA Museum, who I think are with us this afternoon, for including this unique recognition of the unit's contribution to the state's military and social history in that valuable exhibition space in the refurbished building. Rob mentioned Andrew Hastie, MHR for Canning, who is the Assistant Minister of Defence. And I'd just like to thank him again for continuing to reward deserving students and schools in his electorate with the Double Reds Resilience Award. 15 schools participated in the award last year, and Andrew's expecting between 15 and 20 schools to participate again this year. So thank you, Andrew, for that support. I'd also like to mention Vince Connolly, MHR for Stirling, for assisting me with making representations to successive Ministers for Veterans Affairs regarding the awarding of a unit citation for gallantry to the second, and the restoration of the Derry Memorial and the potential establishment of a new Australian Defence Forces Memorial in Dili, and some progress seems to be getting underway in that regard. So thank you, Vince, for your assistance with that. Wrapping up my remarks, the Committee of the Association reviewed its current status at the AGM and feels that the future looks bright in terms of supporting our objectives. And the wonderful attendance today is very encouraging in that regard. However, to ensure that bright future, we would appreciate our supporters becoming members or renewing their memberships, especially. Younger members of our great fraternity are especially encouraged to follow up in this way to better ensure that the association has a longer term future even after the current generation of immediate descendants of the soldiers, like myself, move on. And in conclusion, I would like to thank Rob and Louis, and especially Rob, for his sterling work today in preparing for this event, acting as Master of Ceremonies, and also making his office available for the Association committee meetings. After 11 years preparing for the annual ceremony and being MC, Rob has decided to call it a day, and myself and other committee members will take on the task from next year. Rob, your contribution in this regard has been outstanding and a very hard act to follow. Also, thank you to Louis for being Rob's offsider over all that time, and both your efforts are very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you for those kind words. If you've attended these ceremonies in recent years, you will be familiar with how the ode should be recited. In a moment, one of our committee members, Mr. John Burridge, MG, who won his Medal for Gallantry in Vietnam, will recite the ode, and you'll see what I mean. I want to add a little tip, a little bit of useful protocol for now and for any time the ode is recited. The ode will finish with the phrase, "Lest we forget." Whenever that is said, please answer it yourself with "Lest we forget." Don't be shy. That says to the speaker and to the world that you agree with what was said and you're not afraid to say so. After the ode, the bugler will play the last post, the catafalque party will present arms, and that will be followed by a minute's silence. The silence will be broken by another bugle call, the rouse. Please stand.
They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end, against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Lest we forget. Thank you.
Please be seated. That almost concludes this afternoon's ceremony. Please join me in thanking our piper, musician Davina Goldthorpe, and our bugler, Captain David Cusworth. After today's ceremony, two things. Please remember to sign the attendance book if you haven't already. Second, please join us for a drink and a bite to eat at the Captain Stirling Hotel. In a moment, the catapult party will withdraw, ending our ceremony. As they get ready to do that, please stand and join me in thanking them. Thank you all very much.